Chapter 6. Riding an Everyday Diaspora. During the winter of 1862 to 1863, John Nelson Darby, while spending most of his time in southern Ontario, began to think about extending his missionary work to the United States. At first, this was a modest ambition, nothing approaching a campaign or even an exploratory expedition. Ralph Evans had called his attention to simple pastoral duties south of the Great Lakes. Evans had received a message from French and Swiss brethren from Europe, who were either farming on prairie land near St. Louis, Missouri, or a few living in the city itself. Through him, they invited Darby to visit. There were also French-speaking communities in Cordova, Illinois, northwestern Illinois, on the Iowa-Illinois border, who had written for Darby's attention to Arthur Wells, and in Detroit, those who greatly desired to see Mr. Darby. In early March 1863, Darby wrote that he was contemplating going to the States when spring comes in a little. One understands why he looked forward to spring. In his letter, he noted that they had experienced 62 and 64 degrees of frost over the winter, but that in general it has been a mild one for this country. However, they have brought loads of hay across Lake Ontario on the ice. It was about a foot thick. Darby made what appears to be his first trip into the United States in late April or early May 1863, covering the French and Swiss groups of brethren mentioned earlier, and also calling on some persons in New York State and in Chicago. St. Louis, though, was what counted most at this time, and further, that city and Darby's various subsequent visits to it turn out to be salient in the subterranean history of American apocalypticism. In Darby's immediate focus, his American visit of less than 1 month, and he was proud to note 2,000 miles, was the spiritual welfare of the scattered French-speaking brethren who farmed the edges of the great American prairie. Darby said he was out in the prairies, living among them as in old times in France, and glad indeed to see them as they are. America worried him. The system of coming to America, taking up land without being able to pay for it, which they gradually fell into as it is the custom, had brought them spiritually low, pushing as they must to pay, or careless of paying. In St. Louis, he also ministered to German-origin brethren, but mostly it was the French speakers who held his primary concern. Still, at various places, Darby met what he called Americans, meaning English speakers who were not recent immigrants. At Chicago, I was among Americans, and though I felt the desolation, met some who earnestly desire better things. He saw the United States as a great but spiritually poor country. I think any true spiritual mindedness and devotedness, not mere outward activity, would be more despised there than anywhere. But returning again to the people at St. Louis, he says, I was among some nice people, Americans too. St. Louis, indeed. It is of outsized consequence because, first, it provided the invitation for John Nelson Darby's first incursion into the United States. That visit actualized the sense of missionary duty that had been in the back of Darby's mind well before he made the journey to British North America. Secondly, Darby returned various times to St. Louis over the next decade and a half, and this intersects with a matter of American evangelical history that is debated. Did Darby encounter in person the great late-century promulgator of premillennial rapture eschatology and chairman of the Niagara Bible Conferences, James Hall Brooks, 1830 to 1897, longtime St. Louis clergyman? And even if their paths never quite touched, how much did Darby influence Brooks indirectly? Thirdly, When one charts cartographically the boundaries of what becomes Darby's American project, St. Louis is the equivalent of a surveyor's iron post. It marks the southwest corner of Darby's American mission field. Granted, in his later years he took in California on his way to and from New Zealand. St. Louis was as far as he could go in 1863. It was too full of the nearness of the war to be open to much, he judged. But once he had defined the city as a reachable terminus, he kept it in his portfolio. Surprisingly, after this first sortie into the United States, Darby added a second determinative coordinate to his personal version of American geography, and this time it was another city he had yet to visit, Philadelphia. As he explained in a letter to Dr. Edward Cronin, he had received an invitation from an American cousin whom he had not seen since 1817. That man was a clergyman, a Christian, and not incidentally was a D.D. The individual was the Reverend Dr. John Apthorpe Vaughan, 1795 to 1865, a cousin of Darby's on his mother's side. She was a Vaughan. He was 5 years older than Darby, and presumably they had met in England or Ireland, while Darby still was an undergraduate at Trinity College, Dublin. Vaughan was American educated. In 1817, he would have been 2 years out of Bowdoin College. His class consisted of only 8 members, and probably was on a grandish tour, or at least a visitation of the extensive network of Vaughan relatives in the British Isles. He had been just the right age to impress himself on the younger Darby, and indeed the enthusiasm with which Darby in 1863 referred to the invitation to visit Philadelphia is virtually unique in his publications and papers. If one works only with J.N.D.'s own words, it is beyond forensic science to ferret out the basic details of his immediate family, much less his network of powerful and influential relations in London, the West Indies, Maine, and Philadelphia. Darby was seriously averse to admitting his own exceptional connections in the wider world, caring only to credit the Almighty for his own spiritual enlightenment. John A. Vaughan brought out a side of Darby rarely seen. Vaughan in adulthood became an Anglican priest, was rector of churches in Salem, Massachusetts, and in Philadelphia, and at the time he invited his cousin to visit, was professor of pastoral theology at the Protestant Episcopal Divinity School in West Philadelphia. As a Vaughan, his connections in Philadelphia ran deep. One of his collateral ancestors had designed the space often called Independence Square. Another was a secretary of the American Philosophical Society, and the family had social ties with the first generation of Americans after independence, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and, to a lesser degree, George Washington. A decent inference is that not only had John Vaughan imprinted on the adolescent John Nelson Darby, but now, close to half a century later, Vaughan hearkened to an era in Darby's life when Brethrenism was a founding, a deeply serious devotional movement not yet crystallized into an organization, but rather a praying and reading shop for young gentlemen of the right sort. In the late summer of 1862, Darby had sailed to North America by way of the St. Lawrence River, Quebec City to Montreal, and now, somewhat more than a year later, could have been expected to return by the St. Lawrence route. Instead, he decided to return to England by way of a port on the east coast of the United States, New York, or more likely Boston. He cleared up his work in Canada, probably going as far north and east as Quebec City, before heading directly south. He visited New York, where the Swiss have called me, and then Philadelphia and Massachusetts were on his list. There is no reference that I have found concerning how well he got along with his long-lost cousin, who died in 1865, but in subsequent years, Philadelphia in the east, like St. Louis in the west, was a practical boundary post for his missionary work in the United States. Draw a line between them, he very rarely went south of it, even in the later 1870s. Thus, John Nelson Darby's first foray into the United States was haphazard, dependent upon fortuitous invitations, and tentative. He decided to sail on a steam packet to the United Kingdom in mid-October 1863, with memories of things going well in Canada, and with only a vague sense that something had to be done in the United States. A bit more than a month after arriving home in London, he replied to a letter by R.T. Grant, one of the two promising brothers in Canada who had left the Anglican priesthood and become full-time exclusive Brethren evangelists. I was very glad indeed to get your letter and hear of the work in Canada, to which, as well as the beloved brethren there, I have become deeply attached. He wanted to visit North America again, and the States would merit attention, but that would properly require a younger and more energetic man. As I have previously emphasized, the volumes in this study are not a biography of John Nelson Darby, in part because the creation, content, and power of the radical evangelical movement of the later 19th and early 20th centuries was so much bigger than he was, and limiting discussion to him would miss the point entirely. Darby was not in himself the exclusive Brethren movement, much less that of Brethrenism in general, but indirectly affecting those movements, he was a primary cultural vector, in two senses. Just as a vector in the physical world carries a force from one place to another, Darby was the main vector for bringing transatlantic dispensational eschatological beliefs to North America, first to Canada and increasingly to the northern United States. He was also a vector in a second sense, similar to the way a physical vector interacts with topography to create boundaries. For example, think rivers. Darby, in the physical itinerary of his missionary travels in North America, established an informal and unofficial set of boundaries that fit where the great evangelical upsurge in late 19th century apocalyptic evangelicalism in North America found its home soil. One of the big things that Darby instinctively understood was landscape, and how it interacts with social forms and cultural affirmations. From the late 1830s onwards, when on teaching and preaching work, he had moved about the British Isles, France, Switzerland, Germany, and the Low Countries with a speed and facility that would be impressive any time in the pre-airplane era. In his own life of missionary travel, he had encapsulated the transport revolution of the first two-thirds of the 19th century, tramping on footpaths in the French mountains, taking juddering carriages from one Irish village to another, forcing himself to be a patient passenger on canal boats in England and the Low Countries, and finally, when railroads became something more than local curiosities, he sat in carriages that rambled shakily across England and the continent. Darby intuited quickly how transport systems and landscape interacted. He was remarkable in his ability to be in several critical locations within a short period. John Nelson Darby was no Fernand Braudel, but like that epical French scholar, Darby recognized a Mediterranean when he saw one. He understood for his own purposes how an inland sea, its land basin, and its contiguous hinterlands worked. Thus, as a predicate to discussing Darby's sequence of missionary journeys into the United States, a brief and thoroughly secular reminder of the things that Darby, and really any successful transnational entrepreneur, understood about the Great Lakes Basin in the 1860s and 1870s, is necessary. The economic power of the basin, relative to the rest of the North American economy at the time of Darby's arrival in the early 1860s, deserves emphasis. At that time, the Great Lakes Basin and its hinterlands held a hegemony over other North American regional economies greater than any time before or since. Secondly, a sequence of transport revolutions had recently made the basin into a single zone of human communication. And thirdly, those two factors, when combined with a singular pattern of migration from Europe to North America and a usually under-reckoned degree of cross-border migration from Canada to the United States, made the northern part of the United States open to exactly the kind of cultural incursion that Darby proposed. Even a brief glance at the Great Lakes Basin and its contiguous hinterlands at the time of John Nelson Darby's first visit to North America yields the immediate contradiction that these were vast and rich areas, capable of rapid extension that, nevertheless, for the moment, were boxed in. The eastern coast was open to world trade and in-migration. Well-developed seaports provided access to the Atlantic at Quebec City, Montreal, Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. But on the other side, the western periphery, something approaching an invisible wall was present. British North America in the early 1860s had gone as far west as it could go without a spinal transplant, a new form of government, and a large investment in westward transport facilities, most likely railroads. The United States, with the massive American prairie to the west, was implicitly halted at the Mississippi. It is well to remember that the integration of the Great Lakes watershed and that of the Mississippi was limited by the narrow Illinois and Michigan Canal and was not accomplished until the Chicago Drainage Canal was completed in 1900. And to the south, the United States had a hideous problem that threatened the existence of the federal state. The American Civil War drew a border, temporary but long perduring in its effects, between North and South, and for pragmatic military reasons precluded for the moment significant expansion into the West. Thus, a massive ecumeny comprising the northeastern quadrant of the economically active portions of the North American continent for the moment was locked up. One could fairly expect that if the Civil War ended with a northern victory, and if Canada became a self-governing entity, an enormous amount of economic energy would be released, like the force in a coil of spring steel that had been confined and tightened and then finally triggered. In the early Civil War years, such as 1862, when Darby began his North American mission, the Great Lakes Basin and its hinterland was an immediately risky place to invest, but one with a high ratio of potential reward to risk. Accepting the metaphor that the exclusive brethren were invested in acquiring entry to a promising mission field, the United States, a fair question is how large and how easily accessible was that opportunity. In Chapter 4, we showed the topographical lines of the Great Lakes Basin, and the basin is large indeed, encompassing the world's largest inland sea. Those hydrologically determined lines, however, actually are somewhat misleading, for they are minimalist and maximalist at the same time. If one takes, say, the end of the Napoleonic Wars as a vantage point, a case can be made that many of the significant human locations within the basin were separated from each other by physical barriers and not fully part of a single economic or social system. On the other hand, if one jumps to, say, the year of Darby's last work in North America, 1877, one finds that not only have most of the previously isolated places of settlement within the Great Lakes Basin, as narrowly defined, been patched into a comprehensive network of communication and trade, but seemingly by adhesion, a set of hinterlands in the Old Northwest have become peripheral economic satrapies of the basin. In the East, major port cities, previously independent, became partners in a conjoined entity. The distribution of the intangible goods that were the precious cargo of John Nelson Darby and his fellow exclusive brethren was dependent upon the existence of the lines of transport that were developed for tangible items. It is not ociose to quickly remind ourselves of the nature of those lines of communication, for arguably, no turnpikes, no canals, no railroads, then no Victorian Revolution in North American evangelicalism. There was a time when American school children memorized the early history of the Erie Canal system. The celebrations for its opening in 1825 and the route from New York City to Buffalo, and for extra credit, the continued trip upstream on navigable rivers and on to the Great Lakes, Erie, Huron, and Michigan, that tied in Detroit and Chicago. And Canadian children, for their part, learned the glories of the Welland Canal, opened in 1829, which bypassed Niagara Falls and allowed modest-sized vessels to pass from Lake Erie to Lake Ontario, and then down the St. Lawrence River. Each set of school children chanted its own national mnemonics, and never did the twain meet. The 1820s opening of the two major canals makes it easy to forget that the systems of shipment and transport centered on the Great Lakes grew continually, and like the reticulations of a spider's web bringing in secondary filaments, expanded well into the 20th century, when the St. Lawrence Seaway opened the entire Great Lakes system to direct large ship transatlantic vessels. Figure 6.1, included in the print and ebook versions of this book, shows the power-navigable natural waterways in 1860. Power-navigable means by aid of steam, sail, or animal power. By that time, most passenger traffic had been taken over by railroads, the chief exception being passengers up and down the Great Lakes and Upper St. Lawrence. But large load freight was still most efficiently done by slow-moving canal boats and Great Lakes sailing vessels and steamers. None of this is tied directly to the evangelical revolution of the later 19th century, but all of it is indirectly involved. In his big screen study of the settler revolution in the Anglo world, James Belich points to the formative aspect of non-industrial technologies, most particularly improvements in waterborne transportation that had direct cultural impact. The biggest change of all was in attitudes to moving. Emigration ceased to be an act of desperation and became an act of hope. The system of canals, rivers, and the Great Lakes greatly reduced the friction of distance in the northeastern quadrant of North America. By John Nelson Darby's time, most of the movement was of goods rather than people. Although the fundamental flow of the Great Lakes system was west to east, gateways emerged that encouraged north-south transport. Most important, corridors between the United States and British North America were formalized. Southwestern Ontario, where the exclusive Brethren ministry was strongest, contained one of the widest of these conduits. Where gateways were open, humans could pass easily, and when men and women moved across borders, they brought with them their cultural treasures, not least religion. First introduced into the United States by eastern cities without long navigable rivers that needed alternative access to a hinterland, railroads arrived early as a clever but minor variant during the canal phase of the transportation revolution. Thus, John J. Bukovchik aptly summarized the opening of the railroad era. Quickly, the minor variant metamorphosed from being an auxiliary to the canals to being their senior partner. By 1860, in the United States, the volume of freight on railroads equaled that of the canals. It would be a mistake, however, to see the railroads either as an autonomous economic engine or even as a suppressant of the canals. Instead, the interdigitation of water and rail, especially in the Great Lakes Basin and its hinterland, was what counted. A nice example is Chicago, located directly on the basin having at the start of the Civil War 11 fairly short railroads serving it. The major railways in the Great Lakes Basin and hinterlands are shown in Figure 6.2. The U.S. system developed more quickly than did the Canadian. From the completion of the Grand Trunk in 1859 to the CPR in 1885, the Canadian rails were chiefly a spine from Quebec City to Detroit, with a few short lines tying into the United States. Integration of rolling stock on Canadian and U.S. lines took well into the 1870s, as the distance between the rails in Canada was 5 feet 6 inches, and that in the United States 4 feet 8.5 inches. The railways and the canals surrounding the Great Lakes had a dual effect: to effectively enlarge, in economic terms, the size of the Great Lakes Basin, and to create an economic gravitational system whose force field ran at right angles to the way its lines of the Great Lakes and the Laurentian system appeared on the map. Take the first, what historical geographers have sometimes identified as the Great Lakes Economic Region. By 1870, included large portions of the states of New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, eastern Minnesota, and patches of Missouri around St. Louis. Additionally, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, and by rail, Maine were included. In Canada, Ontario, of course, and given the Lake Champlain water and rail access, eastern Quebec province around Montreal was tied into the New England states. One should not confuse this economic region with matters of state formation. In this case, one had 2 federal states after 1867, each suspicious of the other and uncomfortable with the fact that around the basin they were joined at the hip. Secondly, the economic entity was asymmetrical. The U.S. portion was much larger in terms of economic and social goods. The relationship can be formulated, overly simply, but accurately enough for an understanding of the Brethren missionary movement, as U.S. capital moved in asymmetrical fashion to the north of the basin, and Canadian labor in an equally unbalanced fashion to the south. Now, in summarizing in necessarily secular terms the transnational situation in North America that John Nelson Darby and the exclusive brethren encountered, am I developing some slightly bent Marxian theory of mission fields? I hope not. The exercise here is to do 2 things: to formulate in simple terms the secular reality that the exclusive brethren in Canada faced, as the movement made yet another transnational move, this time from central Canada across the U.S.-Canada border into the southern portion of the Great Lakes Basin and its hinterlands. That reality was at heart geographical, the lakes, and secondarily economic, and thirdly socio-demographic in character. My second purpose is to answer a question concerning Darby and his fellow workers. Did they get it? Yes, they did, directly and consciously. They understood the neural network that was rapidly emerging: transport, frequent long-distance communication as between individuals, and most especially, the inevitable human flow from Canada into the United States at the granular level, where geography, economics, and social patterns interacted. The pattern proved a problem for the assemblies in Canada, but a countervailing opportunity in the States. In 1866, Darby wrote from Toronto, "We have a trial, less known in England, moving about, going to the States to get work, etc. This, of course, tends to unsettle the gatherings, sometimes forming a new nucleus where there is energy of faith. Out of Canada, it is now in a measure planted in the West, but all is to do there." Through their actions, the mid-Victorian brethren in central Canada, and increasingly in the United States, showed they understood at the level of everyday assembly forming that they were in a flow situation which was unprecedented. In their practicality in recognizing the phenomenon, they did better than many historians and geopolitical observers have done. Randy Wittes suggests that what he refers to as the prevailing exegesis of the borderlands historiography is blinkered. He notes that because of the real national consciousness of East-West expansion in both countries, the equally real North-South dimension has been heavily shadowed. And among other things, when one loses awareness of the extraordinary character of population movements in the Great Lakes Basin and its hinterland, all sorts of social and cultural phenomena are lost, including the catalytic phase of radical evangelicalism. As we discussed in Chapter 4, the expansion of Christianity in the 19th century is in large part due to the Great European Migration of 1815 to 1914, in which 55 to 60 million Europeans, including migrants from the British Isles, left their homeland, mostly for permanent settlement in some new world. The largest portion arrived in North America in the years between the end of the Civil War and beginning of World War I, and most of that group settled in the United States. We have noted that Canada, in the second half of the 19th century, had a strong migrant flow from the British Isles, hardly a surprising fact, though it is salient for understanding both the inception of Brethrenism in North America and also in its early flow pattern from Canada to the United States. Not unnaturally, when we read John Nelson Darby's letters discussing the problem of his exclusive saints moving southward to the United States, it is easy to assume that this was a simple continuation of the Europe to North America flow. Actually, it is a little more complex than that, and Darby rode the wave well. If one looks at big numbers, one encounters a fact that is also a disguising truth. The Canadian population in the relevant years grew from 3,343,000 at Confederation to 5,301,000 in 1900. This is accurate, but in our context is a disguising truth, because it leads to the quick inference that Canada was a country of reception, and that therefore, in this mode of inference, that Darby, in losing his Canadians to the United States, was losing almost entirely persons who had been part of the transatlantic in-migrant flow. Actually, it was quite different, and because this fact is not built very well into the general Canadian historiography, much less that of North America generally, we need to look at it a bit more closely than if it were a generally reckoned matter. It tells us something consequential about the flow of the Christian diaspora into the United States. What is so exceedingly strange, in my view, is that in the half of the 19th century, it is accurate to describe Canada as a country of emigration, and almost all of that was to the United States. The big outflow began even before the Civil War ended. But for reasonably tight data, it is sure to stick with the better recorded part of the century. In the last quarter of the century, the number of immigrants to Canada was somewhat above 1.5 million, 1,549,000, and the number emigrating was nearly 2 million, 1,964,000. More people were leaving than arriving, so the growth in population was dependent upon natural increase, the excess of births over deaths being greater than the net loss from migration. This is not what a New World destination is supposed to look like. It hints that any collective social group, religious faiths included, had to deal with a situation much more roiled than it appeared on the surface. To put it in international perspective, in the mid-1870s, a time of high economic stress, Canada had a rate of emigration from its population that was the second highest in the world, exceeded only by Ireland. The only year for which the absolute numbers of various national flows to the United States are available is 1881, when 125,450 moved south from Canada, the second largest national cohort to migrate to the United States, behind only the Germans. Roughly 1/4 of the Canadians were French-speaking and overwhelmingly from Quebec, rising from 1/4 of the total in the 1860s to 1/3 near century's end. Their destinations were the New England states, particularly the mill towns of Vermont and later of Massachusetts. Of the English-speaking majority, most of the emigrants from Canada were from Ontario. They were almost entirely of the basic population of the province, meaning of Anglo-Celtic ethnicity, to use a slightly awkward term: English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish. What clearly was happening is that second, third, and even fourth-generation Canadians constituted most of the exit stream. Primarily, it was Canadians who were leaving Canada. By 1901, the peak of the phenomenon, 20.2% of persons born in Canada were living in the United States. That is a truly astounding number in international context. That 1 out of every 5 persons born in Canada decided to spend their lives outside of their homeland is comparable only to the situation of Ireland and Norway, poverty-stricken and famously the leaders of Victorian-era collective out-migration. Canada, however, was by no means poverty-stricken. There is as yet no general theory that covers adequately the migration from the north of the Great Lakes Basin to the southern side and its hinterlands, much less its relationship to social, cultural, and governmental formations on each side of the border. The situation was not much commented on at the time. Until 1908, there were customs limits both ways to the movement of goods across the border, but no restrictions on the movement of Canadian immigrants into the United States until the mid-1920s. Individuals and families simply pulled up sticks in Ontario, and it was common to have families living on both sides of the border. Until a satisfying general theory is devised, 2 simple facts are of propelling force, and each of these was well recognized by the exclusive Brethren missioners, and particularly by John Nelson Darby. The first of these is that the overwhelmingly majority of the Anglophone leavers were from Ontario, and second, that they decamped in large numbers because of land and wages. Of course, there were exceptions, but basically they were the children or grandchildren of immigrants from the British Isles, Canadian-born and culturally assimilated to Canada, as central Canada was running out of empty land that was suitable for settlement. Granted, by the early 1870s, the Confederal state of Canada had a great deal of empty land, but most of it was not farmable, and a massive territory in the West was not yet easy of access. This may seem counterintuitive, just look at all that land. But from the mid-19th century onwards, a land pinch was developing in Ontario. The combination of the Canadian Shield and the boreal forest made commercial agriculture very difficult, almost impossible given the technology of the time, beyond, in most areas, 50 kilometers away from the lakes. By 1870, Ontario was out of useful empty land, the sort that a younger son could acquire for next to nothing and turn into a farm. Instead, land now had to be purchased from a previous settler, and for second, third, fourth sons, this often was beyond the ability of many families. So, grown men and women left. Some went directly to the United States, others made a stepwise trip, settling first in one of the larger towns of Ontario, then moving south. Thus, between 1860 and 1900, several central Canadian urban areas grew by internal migration, but only Toronto and Montreal truly burgeoned, since they took in rural Anglo-Canadians and also were the only places where immigrant arrivals from the Old World outnumbered departures to the United States. Those who made their first move to a town or a city in Ontario almost inevitably became wage laborers, an umbrella term that covers everything except urban farmers, dairies, business owners, and professionals. When things went badly in the local economy, or they simply became ambitious, these people often moved south, since wages in almost all fields were higher in the United States. For some, the decision was to liberate family capital from high-demand farms in southwestern Ontario and establish larger operations in cheaper places on the south side of the basin, for example, Michigan. In 1880, Canadians made up 11% of the foreign-born population in the United States. Likely two-thirds of them were English speakers from Ontario, and mostly they settled in the hinterlands of the Great Lakes. The general view at the time in the United States was that the Anglo-Canadians were the right sort. This is not surprising, given the rising sensitivity in the United States as century's end approached to the alleged danger to that society of the increasing inflow of Southern Europeans. The Ontario-origin Canadians spoke English, were not insufferably British, and did not need to have the economic and social system of the northern states explained to them. Most commentary and subsequent studies has seen the Canadian-born immigrants as doing well economically, moving towards the cities as part of the general urban population drift, but staying mostly within the Laurentian Great Lakes system. James T. Shotwell, founding director of research at the Carnegie Foundation, described the British Isles-descended Canadians in the United States in language that is slightly cringe-making but revealing. What marked them off from the European immigrant was the fact that they fundamentally belonged to the same racial stock as those among whom they settled, and therefore never presented any serious problems of social and political readjustment. Our compressed conspectus of foundational economic and demographic reality is not an exercise in secular smoke dancing, designed just to clear the room. It should not be necessary, but because the material is not part of the standard background of New World evangelical history, it is required. Here we must emphasize that we are engaged in one of the fundamental acts in writing the history of any major religion, charting its spread, and that very often is a matter of geography. There are 2.5 basic narratives in the usual and useful story of the Christian diaspora. The gospel is spread by heroic missionaries, a phalanx that starts with the Apostle Paul, or the faith is spread through population movements, either via the imperially forced conversion of large groups, think Constantine, or by populations that are at least nominally Christian, colonizing other lands and peoples. Those are the 2 basic stories, and each has its place. A third strand of the narrative is not quite independent of either of those 2, tracing the development of Christianity's core ideas and liturgical practices, and positing this ideational evolution as causal to Christianity's diaspora. This can be done at an abstract level, and some brilliant minds have worked this way. But the practice is slightly unsatisfactory because disembodied ideas do not travel on their own. They need missionaries or armies or settlers to carry them forward. In terms of both the growth of numbers of adherents and the territory captured, the period from the end of the Napoleonic Wars to World War I is far beyond anything that occurred previously in the Christian diaspora. That holds whether one approves or not. The association with colonialism is not easy to abide. Yet undeniably big things happened, including the Christianization at some level of virtually the entire Western Hemisphere, and large incursions into Africa and Asia. So, of course, we pay attention to any population movement significant enough to form a wave that could carry the faith, its missionaries, and its everyday adherents from one place to another. John Nelson Darby concluded his final sojourn in North America in June 1877. There is a sound assemblies list for the Exclusive Brethren for 1880 that has a list of foreign references, providing the town or city of each assembly, and in most cases, the assembly's address and the name of one of its chief men. In Canada, there were 106 assembly locales, towns and cities, a few of them with multiple fellowships. 91 of these were in Ontario, which says that virtually every larger than a crossroads town in the province had an assembly. In the United States, where the missionary work had begun later, there were 94 locales, again some with multiple fellowships. Most were situated like a necklace around the cities and towns of the Great Lakes Basin. A physically larger, but numerically smaller sector was found in the remainder of the northeastern U.S. quadrant that Darby had marked out on his journeys: New York City, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Central Illinois, Missouri, and now Iowa. Beyond that, one finds scattered shoots, as in California, Tennessee, Nebraska. Neither a revival nor a revolution. These numbers are small, but that was the nature of Brethren missionary work. What counted was the famous 2 or 3 gathered together in devotion and in life commitment to the faith. A fair estimate, derived from the 1890 U.S. Census information, is that the assemblies on average numbered close to 20 adult men and women who had confessed faith and been vetted. Youngsters and adult associates who attended some functions did not count. These were folk who were committed to full separation, not only from all other failed faiths, but drawn back silently from many secular activities, such as municipal office holding. They had their own social, moral, and doctrinal code. Given that the exclusives were never going to be a mass religion, were they to have become popular, that would have been a sign of whorish apostasy, and thus of failure. The establishment by the time of Darby's death of their assemblies in roughly 200 towns and cities of North America was no small thing. A mission field is something specific. It should not be confused with home missions, which most mainline denominations had created earlier in the 19th century to press their case across the Appalachian Mountains, a perhaps benign form of domestic imperialism, the East attempting to civilize the West. The Exclusive Brethren mostly moved into the United States from the North. At the leadership level, they had a self-conscious awareness that they were part of a missions to foreign lands tradition. They had a distinct gospel, and they were bringing it to a foreign land.